Chester William Nimitz Jr. was born on February 17, 1915, in Brooklyn, New York, though his family's ties stretched across California and Texas. From the moment he entered the world, the Navy was already in his blood. His father, Chester W. Nimitz Sr., was not yet the legendary admiral who would command the Pacific Fleet in World War II, but he was already making his mark as a young officer, admired for his technical brilliance and calm, calculating leadership. For young Chester Jr., this meant that childhood was never entirely ordinary. The Navy wasn't simply his father's career. It was the backdrop of his family life. Dinner conversations touched on deployments, ships, and strategy, and the family lived in a world defined by naval bases and military discipline. For Chester Jr., his father was not only dad, but also a rising figure in a profession where greatness was demanded. From his earliest years, there was an unspoken expectation that he too would serve. Growing up, Chester Jr. showed himself to be intelligent, disciplined, and athletic. He was not the type to rebel against authority or search for a path far from his family's shadow. Instead, he seemed to embrace the challenge, determined to earn respect in his own right. Friends and classmates later recalled that he carried himself with a seriousness beyond his years. A young man aware that more than just his own reputation was at stake, he bore the name of a man already destined for history. In 1932, at the height of the Great Depression, Chester Jr. entered the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland, following directly in his father's footsteps. Annapolis was and remains one of the most demanding institutions in the nation. Days began at dawn with grueling drills, endless inspections, and an unforgiving academic schedule. Many cadets, overwhelmed by the pressure, never made it through. But Chester Jr. not only survived, he thrived. He wasn't coasting on his father's reputation. Among his peers, he became known for his persistence, composure, and quiet confidence. His demeanor reflected the same steadiness that had marked his father's rise in the Navy, calm under pressure, even-tempered, and always prepared. By the time he graduated in 1936, Chester Jr. had chosen the most dangerous and demanding branch of naval service, submarine warfare. At that time, submarines were far from the massive nuclear-powered vessels we think of today. They were small, cramped, and fragile machines, notorious for their risks. A single mechanical failure or a miscalculated maneuver could spell disaster for the entire crew. Life beneath the surface was claustrophobic and harsh, with stale air, cramped bunks, and constant tension. For many sailors, the idea of serving in a submarine was terrifying. For Chester Jr., it was the future. He saw submarines as the sharp edge of naval innovation, a place where courage and technical skill were tested at their highest level. As the 1930s gave way to global instability and the clouds of war thickened, Chester Jr. was already deeply immersed in this world. He trained extensively in stealth operations, torpedo warfare, and survival beneath the sea. Just as his father had pushed the Navy forward into modern strategies of fleet command, Chester Jr. was preparing to carry his family's tradition into the perilous, silent world of undersea combat. Soon, with World War II erupting across the Pacific, he would find himself tested in ways that would shape not only his career, but his entire legacy. This was the beginning of Chester W. Nimitz Jr.'s journey, not just the son of a hero, but a man determined to prove himself in the unforgiving depths of submarine warfare. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent in 1945, Chester W. Nimitz Jr. emerged from the conflict as a decorated submarine commander. He had served with courage, commanding both the USS Haddo and the USS Permit during some of the most dangerous patrols in the Pacific theater. His leadership had earned him the Silver Star and the Bronze Star, medals that symbolized not only his personal bravery, but also his ability to guide men through situations where survival itself was never guaranteed. For a moment, it seemed as though his life might follow the same arc as his father's, rising steadily through the ranks of the Navy. But the post-war years brought a different reality. The world had changed. The Navy, once at the center of a global conflict, was now part of a peacetime America, where nuclear weapons and geopolitics, rather than massive sea battles, defined strategy. Chester Jr. continued to serve diligently, building his career, and by 1957 he had risen to the rank of Rear Admiral. It was an impressive achievement in its own right, yet in the shadow of his father, who had commanded the entire Pacific Fleet, even the rank of Admiral seemed modest by comparison. That same year, after more than 2 decades in uniform, Nimitz Jr. made a surprising choice. He retired from the Navy. He was just 42 years old, still relatively young, with decades of energy and ambition ahead of him. Unlike his father, who would remain tied to naval service until the very end, Chester Jr. turned toward a new frontier, the corporate world. In the booming 1950s and 60s, America was entering a golden age of business, technology, and scientific progress. Chester Jr., with his disciplined military background and leadership experience, quickly found his place. He first joined Texas Instruments, a company that was riding the wave of the electronics revolution. At a time when transistors and semiconductors were reshaping modern life, Texas Instruments stood at the cutting edge, and Chester Jr. proved himself capable of navigating the fast-paced world of private industry just as skillfully as he had commanded submarines. But perhaps his most influential role came when he joined Perkin-Elmer Corporation, a defense and technology company known for its precision instruments and optics. He rose quickly through its ranks, eventually becoming president and later chairman. Under his leadership, Perkin-Elmer expanded its reach, building technologies that would be used in defense, science, and even space exploration. For a man who had spent his early years submerged in the silent depths of submarines, it was remarkable to see him guiding a company that was helping humanity look to the stars. Colleagues remembered him as a thoughtful but firm leader, someone who demanded excellence but inspired loyalty. Much like his father, he had a calm demeanor that commanded respect without theatrics. He wasn't the kind of executive who needed to shout orders. Instead, he carried himself with quiet authority, the same qualities that had steadied him during combat patrols beneath the Pacific Ocean. Yet beneath the surface, there was always the question of legacy. His father's name was now immortalized, etched in history books, celebrated in monuments, and soon emblazoned on the side of one of the Navy's most powerful symbols, the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz. For Chester Jr., no matter how successful he became in business, no matter how many lives he had led through war, or how many companies he had guided in peace, he remained the son of Admiral Nimitz. His life was accomplished, but always compared. Still, during the 1960s and 70s, Chester Jr. represented a new kind of military leader, one who could transition seamlessly into civilian life, applying the discipline of service to the challenges of industry. In many ways, he embodied the post-war American dream: honor in uniform, prosperity in business, and respect in both worlds. But the burden of legacy is heavy. For Chester Jr., every promotion, every achievement, and every accolade seemed to echo with a question: would he ever escape his father's shadow? As the decades passed, the answer grew more complicated. His father's legacy grew larger, immortalized with each passing year, while Chester Jr. quietly continued his own work, proud but uncelebrated. And as time went on, another struggle began to take shape, one not of war or competition, but of the relentless march of aging and the toll it would eventually take on both his body and his spirit. As the decades rolled on, Chester W. Nimitz Jr. had built a life of quiet accomplishment. He had risen through the ranks of the Navy, commanded submarines during some of the most perilous years of the Pacific War, and then reinvented himself as a successful corporate executive. By most measures, his life was one of extraordinary achievement. And yet, when people heard the name Chester Nimitz, they did not think of the man in the boardroom or the decorated submarine commander. They thought of his father, the architect of victory in the Pacific, the admiral who had stood shoulder to shoulder with history itself. The weight of legacy is something few people truly understand. For Chester Jr., it was both a source of pride and a quiet burden. He was proud of his father, deeply respectful of his role in shaping the outcome of World War II, but it was impossible to ignore the comparisons. Every introduction, every conversation, every headline carried that inevitable qualifier: the son of Admiral Nimitz. Even in his own distinguished career, the shadow of his father's name loomed large, sometimes casting his accomplishments into obscurity. By the 1970s, the United States Navy had enshrined Admiral Chester W. Nimitz Sr. as one of its greatest figures. His leadership at Midway and throughout the Pacific Campaign was celebrated in books, documentaries, and classrooms. Statues were erected, naval bases bore his name, and in 1975 the Navy commissioned the first of a new class of supercarriers, christening it the USS Nimitz. It was the ultimate symbol of permanence, his father's name etched into the steel of one of the largest warships in the world, destined to sail for decades as a floating city and a projection of American power. For Chester Jr., the pride was real, but so was the reminder. His father had become immortal, a figure larger than life. And what of the son? He had no carrier, no monument, no statues in his honor. His legacy was quieter, measured in successful patrols, in leadership during crises, in boardroom decisions that advanced technology. Important, yes, but not the stuff of national legend. Those close to him noted that Chester Jr. never outwardly complained about this imbalance. He did not lash out or seek recognition in dramatic ways. Instead, he carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had defined his father. But inwardly there may have been questions about recognition, about identity, about how history would remember him, or whether it would remember him at all. And there was something else. Time, which honors some names, also erodes the strength of the body. As Chester Jr. entered his later years, he began to experience the physical frailty that comes to all. Decades of discipline could not prevent the decline of health. His heart grew weaker. A painful stomach condition plagued him again and again. His wife Joan, his companion for more than 60 years, faced her own battles with cancer and chronic illness. For two people who had lived active, purposeful lives, the limitations of aging were not just physical. They were emotional. Reminders that control was slipping away. In those years, the shadow of his father's greatness was joined by a new shadow, the inevitability of decline. Chester Jr. had lived a life of duty, of service, of leadership in both war and peace. But now, in his twilight years, he faced the same questions every human being must eventually confront. How do you measure a life? By comparison to others? By the scale of achievements? Or by the choices you make when everything else has been stripped away? It was within this crucible of legacy, health, and dignity that Chester Jr. and his wife would make the decision that defined the final chapter of their story. A decision that stunned many, but one that was born not out of despair alone, but out of love, autonomy, and a desire to meet the end on their own terms. By the 1990s, Chester W. Nimitz Jr. and his wife Joan had left behind the noise of boardrooms and the relentless pace of naval life. They settled quietly in Marblehead, Massachusetts, a small seaside town steeped in New England history. For a couple who had spent their lives bound to the rhythms of war and work, Marblehead offered peace, narrow streets lined with colonial houses, the salty smell of the Atlantic in the air, and a harbor filled with sailboats that rose and fell with the tide. Here, Chester and Joan entered what should have been the calmest chapter of their lives. But peace is not always found in old age. Both Chester Jr. and Joan carried with them the scars of time. He had lived much of his adult life with a recurring painful stomach condition that flared unpredictably, leaving him in agony. In his later years, he also suffered from heart disease, which weakened his once strong frame and left him drained of the energy that had sustained him through war and leadership. Joan's health was even more fragile. She had endured battles with cancer, along with a host of other chronic ailments that made daily life a constant challenge. For two people who had been fiercely independent, people who had traveled the world, faced danger, and built lives of responsibility, the creeping dependency of old age was not just frustrating. It was unbearable. Yet despite their ailments, their bond remained unshakable. Chester and Joan had been married for more than 60 years. They had weathered long deployments, uncertain wartime nights, career transitions, and the inevitable sacrifices of military life. To outsiders, their marriage was a testament to loyalty and devotion. In Marblehead, neighbors remembered them as a couple who were always together, who still enjoyed each other's company even in their final years. That companionship was perhaps the greatest anchor of Chester Jr.'s life, a steady presence that had guided him through every chapter. Still, the reality of their situation grew increasingly stark. The illnesses were not temporary setbacks. They were progressive, relentless, and with each passing year the couple's world grew smaller. Trips outside the home became fewer. Physical pain became constant, and the horizon of possibility narrowed. It was not a matter of if their health would fail them entirely, but when for many old age brings acceptance, the willingness to endure, to let time run its course no matter how frail the body becomes. But Chester Jr. and Joan saw their situation differently. They had lived lives defined by choice, by decisive action in moments of uncertainty. He had commanded submarines in wartime. She had stood by his side through every chapter. Now, as their bodies betrayed them, they refused to surrender their final days to suffering and decline. In private, the couple began to speak openly of what they wanted, not just for their lives but for their deaths. They agreed that they would not let disease or incapacity dictate the terms. They would decide together on their own time with dignity intact. To some, this would later appear shocking, even unthinkable. But to Chester and Joan, it was the ultimate act of autonomy and perhaps the final expression of their lifelong devotion to one another. As the year 2001 turned to 2002, Chester Jr. was 86 years old. He had lived a life of service, honor, and quiet accomplishment, but now he and Joan stood at the threshold of their most difficult decision. Their final years had brought them pain, but also clarity, and in that clarity, they chose to face death the way they had faced life, together, united, and unafraid of making hard choices. The stage was set for a final act that would not be written in history books of battles or business, but in the private, solemn walls of a New England home, a decision that would shock the world and force all who heard it to reflect on the meaning of love, dignity, and control over one's fate. On January 2, 2002, in the quiet town of Marblehead, Massachusetts, Chester W. Nimitz Jr. and his wife Joan carried out the most decisive and final act of their long lives together. At the age of 86, after more than 6 decades of marriage, they chose to end their lives in a carefully planned joint suicide. For many, the news was shocking. Chester Jr. was the son of one of the most celebrated military leaders in American history. He had commanded submarines in the Pacific, had been decorated for valor, and had gone on to become a successful executive in the booming years of post-war America. Joan had stood by his side through every chapter, from wartime separations to the quiet rhythms of retirement. They had lived full lives, lives of service, accomplishment, and companionship. And yet, in the end, they chose death on their own terms. The explanation lay in the details of their health. Chester Jr. had long battled heart disease, which left him weakened and frail. A recurring and painful stomach condition plagued him in his final years, robbing him of comfort and energy. Joan, his steadfast partner, had endured her own suffering, cancer treatments, chronic illness, and the slow erosion of vitality that comes with age. Together, they faced a future marked not by peace but by pain and dependency. For a couple who had lived their lives with independence, dignity, and control, this was an unbearable prospect. In notes they left behind, they explained their decision plainly. This was not desperation, but determination. It was not surrender, but resolve. They did not want to prolong their suffering, nor burden their loved ones with the slow decline they knew was inevitable. Instead, they chose to leave the world together, hand in hand in the same unity with which they had lived their lives. It was, in their eyes, not just an ending, but an act of devotion, a final promise kept between husband and wife. The public reaction was divided. To some it was a tragedy, an unthinkable loss that cast a shadow over the Nimitz name. They could not reconcile the image of a decorated naval officer with the idea of choosing death. To others it was an act of profound courage. It was, in its own way, a continuation of the same decisiveness that had guided Chester Jr. through war and guided Joan through a lifetime of shared sacrifice. For them, this was not cowardice but control, the final assertion of autonomy in a life that had been shaped by duty. And yet, what stands out most is not the manner of their deaths, but the bond that carried them to that choice. Chester and Joan had been together for over 60 years. They had seen the world at war, navigated the challenges of peace, and endured the relentless demands of legacy. Through all of it, they had each other. Their final act was not one of isolation, but of unity. They faced the end as they had faced everything else, together, with loyalty and love. When history remembers the name Nimitz, it will always recall Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the father, the hero of the Pacific, the man who turned the tide of World War II. But perhaps there is room, too, to remember his son, not only as the Admiral's heir, or as the accomplished officer and executive he was, but as a man who lived a full, complicated, deeply human life, a man who carried the burden of legacy with grace, who built a career of his own, who loved one woman faithfully for a lifetime, and who, in the end, made the most difficult choice of all. The story of Chester W. Nimitz Jr. does not end with monuments, ships, or statues. It ends in a quiet Massachusetts home, where two people bound by love chose dignity over suffering and unity over separation. Their deaths remind us of the questions we all must face. How do we measure a life well lived? What does it mean to die with dignity? And how do we balance the legacy we inherit with the lives we build for ourselves? For Chester and Joan, the answers lay not in history books nor in the pages of military glory, but in their shared commitment to each other. On that winter day in 2002, they wrote their own ending, one that was as controversial as it was deeply human, and so, the story of Chester W. Nimitz Jr. closes, not as a tale of battle, nor as a footnote to his father's greatness, but as a reminder that behind every name in the history books is a life of choices, struggles, and love. His final act, though debated, speaks to the universal human desire for control, for dignity, and above all, for companionship to the very end.